My guest this morning is Sonja Lyubomirsky. She's professor of psychology at University of California, Riverside, and author of The How of Happiness and recently The Myths of Happiness. Welcome to the show, Sonja.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So you just spoke here at the Canadian Positive Psychology Association conference. You were the opening keynote, and you said, nothing is as misery-inducing as we think. And you started to bust some myths. You were myth-busting around happiness. You mentioned things like divorce, job loss, widowhood. They're not as bad as we think. Starting with job loss, for instance, can you tell us, bust the myth, doesn't job loss make us unhappy?
It does. And all of these things make us unhappy. Divorce makes us unhappy. Not having as much money as we need makes us unhappy. Not finding a life partner. But it turns out that human beings are remarkably resilient. And so they're able to grow and learn and actually sort of sustain happiness or return to happiness even after fairly negative events. Not every negative event, but a lot of them. So for example, so people who lose their jobs, research shows it takes about 4 to 5 years for them to revert back to their previous level of happiness, but they do it on average. People, for example, who don't get married. Some people think, oh my God, I will be forever unhappy if I'm alone all my life. It turns out that lifelong singles are just as happy as lifelong marrieds, and they have up to a dozen lifelong meaningful friendships that they maintain. They're very close with family members. They have very meaningful careers and outside activities. So I guess what I'm saying is that people are just so resilient, and we think that there's so many things in life that, like, if we didn't have X, Y, and Z, we would not be happy. Yeah. That's just not true.
So you can bounce back from negative things like job loss. On the flip side, I saw that your research also says that things that we think are going to make us wildly happy don't quite do that. So let's take having kids. Everybody thinks that having kids is going to make you happy. You have kids, I have kids. So don't kids make us happy sustainably over the long run?
Well, they do, but there are a lot of caveats, right? So I guess one major caveat is that parents report having more meaning in their lives than people who don't have kids. So it's not always about happiness, it's about meaning. But if you just look at well-being, about happiness, life satisfaction, it really depends on what kind of parent and what kind of kids you have. So if you're married, if your kids live with you, if you're older, so age actually matters a lot to happiness of parents. If you have kids when you're young, or if your kids are young, or teenagers, you tend to be not as happy as people without children. So it depends on the kind of child, depends on your situation. But the bottom line is that pretty much overall parents report having more meaning in life than people without children.
And a little plug for fathers. You mentioned something about fathers that really caught my attention, and it turns out that fathers, or men in fact, are happier if they have kids, which might be a little bit, I don't know, surprising to many listeners. So as a father and other fathers listening, what can you say?
It is very interesting because there's really two kind of opposite perspectives. So one is that women say that having children is more central to their identities and their lives. So that would suggest that women would be happier if they are parents as opposed to not be able to be a parent. But women also have been shown to take more kind of the burden of the childcare responsibilities. So, fathers are more likely to sort of play with kids and sort of have fun with their kids. So that might explain why fathers tend to be happier. But another explanation is that men without children tend to be fairly unhappy, and I'm not really sure why. So it's really the men without kids that are the outliers.
Interesting. Now, I want to get to some of your more recent research, but listeners who are unfamiliar with your work and the work that you published in The How of Happiness, you have this kind of famous pie chart, and it talks about how much of our happiness comes from intentional activities versus other things that we do. Just for listeners who are unfamiliar, can you just paint us a picture? What can we do to make ourselves happier, and how much of that pie is that part of?
Sure. So my colleagues and I basically asked the question, what are the main determinants of happiness? And we looked at a lot of literature, and what we found was that if sort of overall in the literature, it shows that a great deal of the individual differences in happiness can be explained by genetics. Now, I don't even want to put a number on it because the numbers are sort of too widely misinterpreted.
There was a big warning sign on your slide even that you wanted to, I think, offset some of the controversy around this pie chart.
Right. I just didn't want people, because people often hear, so for example, the 50%, so roughly the literature shows from behavioral genetics that about 50% of individual differences in happiness are influenced by genetics. And the problem is that that number 50, it could be 30, 40, 60, depending on sort of the study. So basically the bottom line is part of our happiness is genetically influenced, and that's not controversial. There's lots of studies from studies done with twins show that identical twins are much more similar in their happiness levels than our fraternal twins. We also know that life circumstances, how much money you make, what kind of job you have, where you live, are you married, how old are you, those things do influence happiness, but not as much as we think they do. And so really the message is that a great deal of happiness is under our control. We can sort of, by the ways that we think and the ways that we behave, we can increase our happiness if we're motivated to do so.
Right, an inspiring message. A good chunk of our happiness is under our control. And that seems to be the focus of your most recent research. You presented some findings from this app, I think it's called Live Happy. So I was fascinated with that. There's a number of things that ordinary people can do, and you're collecting the data from it. What have you learned from Live Happy, the app?
Sure. So Live Happy, does not allow us to do experiments, but we can kind of see what people in the real world are doing. So this is an app that allows users to use their phones to try to become happier, right? So maybe if you want to increase sort of the gratitude in your life, you could use your phone to text or email or call someone on your contacts list and thank them, for helping you, for playing an important part in your life. Or you can use the app to savor positive experiences. Maybe take a photo with your phone of something beautiful in your life or a person that means a lot to you. And
this was the Savor album?
The sort of the savoring album.
Yes.
So there's all these different types of activities. You can do acts of kindness using your phone and write about them. And so what we find is that if you choose an activity that you like and you feel natural doing, if it kind of fits your personality, you're more likely to try it and it makes you happier. And in general, we find that using this app leads people to report more happiness. Now, we don't have a control group, we don't have an experiment. In other research, I have done what are called happiness interventions, which are kind of like clinical trials, where we test whether, say, trying to be more grateful or trying to be more generous or trying to be more optimistic can make people happier over the long term.
Right. So some of the other research that fascinated me was around cultural difference, and we'll be playing this interview in Toronto. It's a hugely multicultural city, and you've now started to discover some differences in the way people respond to happiness interventions along the lines of what you just said, and you presented some findings, especially around US versus Koreans. When you do an intervention, hey, guess what? The Americans and the Koreans don't respond in the same way. What did you find?
That's right. It was really interesting. We found that American students became happier after they tried to express gratitude to people who are meaningful to them, and also after doing acts of kindness to others. And the Korean students did the same intervention. They became happier when they did acts of kindness, but they became actually less happy when they wrote gratitude letters. And we thought, wow, that is so interesting. And by talking to people in Korea and talking to participants, what we found was that gratitude is sort of a mixed emotional experience. It's a mixed bag in Korea. When Koreans express gratitude, they not only feel grateful and also happy, but they sometimes feel indebted, they feel guilty, they feel a little uncomfortable. And so, and actually we find that now in other cultures as well. So we just finished a study at several French companies in France, and we found that these French employees in these companies, they also felt kind of mixed emotional experiences after expressing gratitude. So expressing gratitude, writing gratitude letters to people in their lives, made them feel more grateful, more elevated, more connected to others, but also made them feel uncomfortable, embarrassed, guilty, and indebted, which we thought was very interesting.
So there's a dark side. There's a flip side of some of these interventions that may be unanticipated.
Exactly.
I was wondering, when you presented the research on cultural differences, you were talking about different nations, but even in the US, and we'd love to have you come to Canada and do your research in Canada, but in multicultural places, have you done any research that differentiates the groups that you're working with, different cultural groups, and how they respond to the different interventions?
Yeah, you know what, we've always wanted to do that because and I live in Southern California, which is also very multicultural, But, and we did do a study in Southern California where we looked at Asian Americans and we compared them to European Americans. And we found that the Asian Americans did benefit from our interventions, also gratitude, and in this case it was trying to be more optimistic, but they didn't benefit as much.
So there was differences still.
There were differences within the U.S. We actually did look at a French company in Canada also, and also showed this kind of mixed emotional experience with gratitude. So we are finding the cultural differences. Often we don't have the sample size, right, where you need a lot of participants of different cultures. And so that's probably why we're going to different countries, because we have big samples, right? You go to Japan, everyone's Japanese. So we did a study, for example, with a company called Hitachi in Tokyo, where we asked people to think about 3 good things that happen at work each week. And the control group wrote about 3 tasks that they accomplished. And we found that these are Japanese employees. Those who wrote 3 good things felt more connected at work, became happier, and they also moved more. They literally had more energy at work.
This was like a tip you were trying to tell us in the talk. The 3 good things. If you were to try and instruct listeners, how can they use that is it a daily basis? Can you overdo it, underdo it once a week? What do you do to make that happen?
Sure. And I'm very interested in sort of these questions about dosage, right? Sort of how much is too much and how much is too little. So in this study, we found that people who wrote, so it's just once a week, it's very simple, once a week, this is what I would suggest to listeners, write down 3 things that went well at work. Or it could be 3 ways that you contributed to the world, would maybe a little bit more grandiose, but just 3 things that went well at work. That makes people feel happier, more connected at work, more engaged. Once a week, write down 3 good things that went well at work. It's really simple.
You heard it, listeners. All of those people who aren't feeling so great at work, this can actually improve your mood, make you feel positive, better, make you a better contributor. Great. Just a final question, Sonja, to bring it all back and thinking about all the things that you've learned about making choices in your own life from what you've learned from your research. What can you share with listeners about the making good choices in your career and in your life from what you've learned from your personal journey and your research?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. I guess what I learned is that, God, I don't know how to answer that question, is that, a lot of us, getting back to the myths of happiness, so a lot of us have misconceptions about sort of how our choices are going to affect our lives, that we think that, I have to, I don't know how to answer that right now.
It's maybe a myth-busting thing, right? Like, because I'm really interested in that, and I think people do a lot of what I've heard called miswanting. They have a bad ability to predict the outcome of the things that they want. They think things are going to make them happy, or conversely, they think things are going to make them unhappy.
Okay, I think I know it. So research shows that people are not very good at predicting their future feelings. So we think that I'll be happy when I do X, or when I don't do Y. And I think, so there's a lot of research, I think that, I'm a scientist, so I like people to rely on the evidence. So for example, research shows that one powerful phenomenon is called hedonic adaptation, that we tend to adapt to most things in life. And so I think that's something that people really should keep in mind, because for example, with jobs, I know lots of people who keep kind of flitting from one job to another, right? They start a new job, and it's exciting, it's a new challenge and new people. After a while, it sort of loses that boost, that excitement, that initial challenge, and you get maybe a little bored, if I may be frank. And so then you start sort of looking around and thinking, maybe that other job is even better. There's always something better around the corner. And then you go to that next job, and there's a transition, and at first it's sort of exciting, and then the same thing happens. And so I'm not saying not everyone does this, but if you're the type of person who kind of feels, I guess, easily bored, and you're constantly kind of looking for the next best thing, that you might want to kind of, reflect and understand that hedonic adaptation is really powerful. There's nothing wrong with you. This is just a human phenomenon. And sort of, I guess, think about and try ways that you might appreciate your current job and add that novelty and excitement and surprise in your current job that can stave off hedonic adaptation. So that means, trying to learn new things, introduce yourself, like create opportunities and challenges in your job that might maintain some of that initial excitement.
Surprise, because I remember you said there were 2 or 3 things: surprise, expressing appreciation. They were the antidotes to the problems that you're describing.
Exactly. Appreciation, novelty and variety, and
Yes.
surprise are the sort of 3 antidotes to hedonic adaptation. And there are ways that we can kind of open ourselves up to challenge, growth, opportunity, surprise. It's not easy, but we can do it, in any situation.
Great. Sonja Lyubomirsky, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.